Welcome to Soul Food Coffee House in Redmond, Washington for the astrology forecast for June of 2019. It's an interesting environment astrologically, cosmically, that we have out there, and we'll get to it in just a moment. I would just like to mention a couple of very quick events. No, they're not very quick events. I would like to quickly mention a couple of events that are coming up. Many of you know I do an annual or 2 retreats a year at Brighton Bush Hot Springs. That's in Central Oregon, about a 2-hour car drive from Portland. I've taught in India, Indonesia, Europe, and Central America, the United States, and I have to say that Brighton Bush Hot Springs is the coolest place I teach. It's totally magical, and whether you go there for one of my retreats or treats or just go there, it's worth it to check it out. My annual summer retreat is a 5-day retreat, and it will begin Sunday night, July 28th, and run through August 2nd. It is filling up. There is still room now, but it will fill up. And so if you're interested, check it out. For those of you out there in internet land, there's a link that is there or somewhere. Secondly, I will be lecturing at the NCGR. That's the National Council for Geocosmic Research, a fancy name that was intended not to have astrology in it. The NCGR conference in Baltimore, and that'll be over Labor Day weekend, and I'll be doing a class and the Saturday night banquet keynote there, and the topic of that lecture will be the Plutocalypse. And of course, I'm referring to the once every 35 years or so conjunction of Saturn and Pluto, and it's the next major astrological event that astrologers are using to predict the end of the world. It ain't gonna happen. Okay. The third thing I want to mention is my 8th, I think, retreat in Bali, Indonesia. And this will be held from November 8th through the 16th. In the early days, I co-taught a bunch of these with my astrology buddy, Jeff Jower. Jeff, as many of you know, passed away a few years ago. And since then, I've been doing them on my own. However, this year, I am thrilled to share with you the fact that I will be co-facilitating this retreat with the awesome Caroline Casey. And do people know Caroline's work at all, any of you? Caroline is an East Coast astrologer who has had a weekly show on WBAI, that's Pacifica Radio in San Francisco, for years. She calls herself a visionary activist and is a very magical and powerful and witchy woman, and we are going to stir up some of the ethers sleeping in the jungles of Bali. And it's an amazing retreat center that was built by a close friend of mine, an astrologer who built it for the purpose of hosting astrological retreats. That will be limited also and will sell out. Right now there is room, but we certainly will certainly have a great time. So here we are at the cusp, which just means edge, of the month of June 2019. As I have been saying now for about 8 months, the most important event, astrologically speaking, in the year of 2019 is the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which occurs on January 11th, 2020. Go think about that. The fact that this is not exact until January of 2020 does not make it any less impactful throughout this whole year. Saturn and Pluto came within a few degrees of each other last month in May. And then Saturn and Pluto are now both retrograding, which means that Saturn being the faster moving of the two of them, Saturn in effect catches up with Pluto. But because they both turned retrograde before the aspect, before the conjunction was perfected, meaning exact, Pluto and Saturn both turned retrograde, and just like moving forward, Saturn retrogrades faster than Pluto, which means that the conjunction is beginning to widen. The fact is that they will both turn direct later this fall, and then Saturn will move faster than Pluto again and catch up to it on January 11th, 2020. The reason why we are starting out the talk tonight about this is that both Saturn and Pluto have important aspects being made to them this month. And from now through the end of the year, this aspect, the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, it's the order of business. One of the lectures that I gave at NORWAC, the Northwest Astrology Conference, last weekend, was a lecture on Pluto and reincarnation. And in order to understand Pluto, which is the lord of the underworld, the lord of everything hidden, Pluto has to do with everything that we don't know, everything that's not on the surface. Pluto is the unconscious. Pluto is the mysterious that's so far out that we just won't solve it or understand it here. Saturn is the gates of reality. In the Greek tradition, Saturn was considered the gatekeeper. Saturn is Satan. Now, lest you go, we're not talking about the modern interpretation, the Christian interpretation of Satan. We're talking about Satan as Lucifer, as the angel who fell from the divine proportion into the earthly proportion through the gates of Saturn, Satan. Saturn and Satan are the same word. In fact, one of the classic modern astrological books by Dr. Liz Green, a Jungian academic, is called Saturn, A New Look at the Old Devil. Because just how many people here do tarot or kind of have some relationship with the tarot? You know that the devil card is not a bad card. You see, Saturn just represents the end of the road. It's the limit. And it used to be that Saturn, which is Latin for Chronos, who is Father Time. Chronos is the time we can measure, as opposed to Kairos, which is the time we cannot measure. But Chronos, Father Time, has a beginning and an ending. And in fact, Saturn is the Grim Reaper. Saturn is karma. Saturn is you get what you deserve. A lot of people have a difficult relationship with Saturn because most of us go through life not doing everything that we can, not living up to our potential. And so when shit happens, that's Saturn saying you don't get what you deserve. Saturn is, in effect, the Grim Reaper, but it doesn't have to involve physical death. Now, the reason why we're talking about Saturn and Pluto is that about every 33 years, but it varies, it can be as many as 38 years and as little as about 30 years, Saturn, which takes 29 and a half years to go around the sun once, Saturn goes around once in 29, let's say almost 30 years, but by then Pluto, which takes 243 years to go around once, by the time Saturn's gone around once, Pluto's moved a little bit further on, so it takes Saturn another few years to catch up to it, which means, and Pluto's a very elliptical orbit, so sometimes Pluto's moving fast and sometimes it's moving slow. And so it takes Saturn about, let's just say 33 years to catch up to Pluto, which means halfway through that cycle, about 16 years or so, it's like they're opposed, like a tug of war, opposite each other. And you can think of this just like the lunation cycle, the cycle from the new moon to the full moon to the new moon to the full moon. It's a conjunction and an opposition. A conjunction when they're in the same place, like Saturn and Pluto will be, or are for all practical purposes now, but will be exact in January of 2011, or when there's a full moon when the sun and moon are opposite each other, as Saturn and Pluto, which are opposite each other about 16, 18 years away. Now, it turns out that if we, and I've done several 2-hour long lectures just on this Saturn-Pluto cycle, but I'm going to be talking about it for the rest of the year because it's so damn important. For example, in 1914, in August, that was within a few weeks of the shot that began World War I. Now, there were other things that happened then too, but I'm just trying to give you an idea of the enormity of some of the events. In 1834, when Saturn and Pluto were aligned, the United Kingdom, Great Britain at that time, abolished slavery throughout the entire British Empire. And at the following conjunction, in 1863, I think, that's when the United States abolished slavery here. So you see these threads that jump, but they're big deal things. By the way, in 1964, Saturn and Pluto were opposite each other, another Saturn and Pluto connection, and that's when we passed the Civil Rights Amendment. It's really weird how these things jump over generations, but 3 times a year, Saturn and Pluto line up, 3 times a century, Saturn and Pluto line up, and then on halfway between those lineups, they're in opposition. They were in opposition in the fall of 2001. Think of anything that happened in the fall of 2001. It was an event that is very dynamic and very important, and it changed things for us. Prior to that, they were actually aligned in 1982, which may not be a huge date on your radar, but there was an Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and in fact, it's the only 20th century war between a colonial power, the United Kingdom, and a New World Western Hemispheric power. In this case, it was Argentina over the Falkland Island War. Bombs were dropped, people were killed. It may not have registered big on our map. You go back to the previous opposition in the mid-60s, and there was the Israeli Six-Day War. There was certainly the Vietnam War. There was the whole cultural revolution in China, the United States, Western Europe in the mid-60s. You go back to the previous conjunction prior to that. In the summer of 1947, within a week was when India and Pakistan were granted independence from the British Empire. And unfortunately, many of us in the West learned that as an amazing thing in the power of civil disobedience, and it's a major event, but somehow many of us don't learn, or maybe they forget purposefully to teach us that nearly 500,000 people were killed in that process between the Hindus and the Muslims as they fought over particularly Kashmir. In other words, the point is that these are neither good nor bad events, but they're powerful events. You go back to in 1931, and that was an opposition, and that was the Chinese invasion of the Japanese invasion of China. It was the rise of Hitler and Stalin and mass fascism, actually, and so on. There's a whole scientific thread of inventions and breakthroughs. What I'm trying to do is to give you a sense that we are in the territory of this Saturn-Pluto conjunction. These slow-moving cycles. It's not like a full moon where people get crazy the day before the full moon, the night of the full moon, and maybe the day after, and then the energy settles down. With these slow-moving outer planet cycles, they're in effect for up to a year before a year during and a year after. So a lot of what we see going on in the globe right now, in the world right now, coming off of an even more powerful Uranus-Pluto square that also harkened back to the 60s, and that Uranus-Pluto square was on and off 7 times between 2012 and 2015. And so it's significant to understand that we've already been washed over with a very powerful, large-scale event, and right on the tail of it, we're getting this kind of rhythm that's a little bit faster, so it grabs more observable events. Oftentimes in our charts, it's the slow-moving transits, like the movements of Uranus or Neptune or Pluto, that set up the biggest changes in our lives. But it's the quicker moving planets, the moon or Venus or Mars, that come sweeping through and make a connection and trigger the event. So in a way, this Saturn-Pluto conjunction, even though we look at it as a slow-moving event of every 30 some odd years, 3 times a century, from a outer planet point of view, look, Uranus and Pluto, or Uranus and Neptune, only line up once every other century, and Neptune and Pluto only line up once every 500 years. So we got here a faster moving thing that's picking it up. And I would suggest that all the craziness that we have going on politically in the United States, the whole Brexit craziness in England or in Great Britain and with Europe, the potential or edgy situations dealing with revolution in France, in Venezuela, in Indonesia, in Brazil. This is a global phenomenon, and I've talked about this at other times. I'm going to not go deeper than this right now, but the fact of the matter is that we are in a state of high polarization. You don't need to be an astrologer to see that. That the energy is tense, it's stretched, it's polarized. And what happens is that Saturn, being the planet of boundaries, and Pluto being the planet that has to do with the death rebirth cycle, Nietzsche's nihilism, that's kind of like a breaking down, a deconstruction and reconstruction. Pluto is like the caterpillar becoming the butterfly. It's a metamorphosis. And so we are at a point in history where 2019, 2020 in particular, we're in the process of this death, rebirth, or metamorphosis, and it would be hubris for me to say that I know when it's going to happen, because I don't. And in fact, I love saying, I've said this several times over the weekend at this astrology conference, that astrology shares something very basic with fundamental religions, modern physics, and Western medicine. And that is the practitioners of all of those things and us practitioners of astrology all believe we know more than we do. Astrology is really useful and it's really valid, but people project their hopes, wishes, and fears into it, and that doesn't mean that it's there in astrology. Astrology is multivalent. The universe is plastic, and by plastic I don't mean artificial, I mean moldable. And when I mean multivalent, I mean that if Mars is physical energy, there are many, infinite perhaps, ways of physical energy encountering the outer world, from very violent to boundary making to kind of wussy. And speaking of wussy, we have Mars right now perhaps at its wussiness, at its wussiest. Wussier, wussy. All right, when you say the superlative form of any adjective in English, you're invoking the planet Saturn, because Saturn is, if we were to look at the symbol for Saturn, it is this. And if you flip that around, it becomes this. And the ST sound in the Indo-European languages, not 100%, but most often invoke Saturn. Saturn is the limit. You can't get any bigger than big st. You can't get any happier than happiest. If you want to put things in order, you give them boundaries, you put them in a line, then you say this is the first and this is the last. Saturn is about crystallization, restriction, structure, status, austerity, stamina stone. Do you hear this? It's kind of crazy, isn't it? Saturn is the limit. Pluto, Uranus just crashes through the limit. Neptune melts the surfaces away and makes the limits, the boundaries, not as real. Pluto, however, comes in and it deconstructs. It deconstructs the structure. It deconstructs the structure and creates a metamorphic process that recreates whatever there was at a newer level, at a higher level of existence. And again, think of the caterpillar becoming the butterfly. In fact, Pluto is often represented in mythology. Pluto is often represented by the phoenix, which is this magical, mythical bird that arises from the ruins of the ashes of destruction. Operative words here: ruins, ashes, destruction. It's like a pine cone that can't grow into a pine tree until a fire comes through and activates. There's a word for that. Biologists here, the fire generating, whatever that is. Pyrogenic, I think, is the guy who's in jail for, no. All right. So we have a chart here for this evening. This is a real-time astro clock, and this clock says that it's approaching 8 o'clock in the evening. I have this set up for Aries rising, though, and so the chart that we're looking at here doesn't have an ascendant. We could put the ascendant in it. So with an Aries rising chart, we always have Aries on the eastern horizon. The reason why we do that is that it makes it easier because people are watching this all over the world. The sun right now, or in the next hour or so, will set here in Seattle. But it's rising in the Mideast, so that what we do by putting Aries on the eastern horizon, what we do is we take away the spinning of the Earth, and we're just looking at where the planets are in their signs. All right, so we do have an interesting configuration right now because we have Mercury in Gemini, Mercury in his own sign, or I should say in her own sign, because Mercury is hermaphroditic. Mercury goes both ways. Mercury is actually bi in every sense of the word, not just in its sexuality, because Mercury goes around the sun, but from Earth's point of view, it just looks like it's going back and forth. And so Mercury is about mercantilism. Mercury is short trips. Mercury is how we send and receive information. Mercury goes both ways, forward and retrograde, forward and retrograde. So we have Mercury in its own sign. Or I guess it would be correct to say Mercury in their own sign, if we're in Gemini, along with the sun. So we have this kind of movement that's setting up the month ahead. We have Jupiter still moving through Sagittarius. Jupiter retrograde now, but Jupiter will be in Sagittarius until the end of this year. And we have Jupiter square Neptune, in turn square Mercury. And so this configuration of 3 planets on 4 points of a big square, of a grand square, this is called a T-square. And this has a lot of stress tied up in it. But it also has awareness. And the awareness here, which will continue through the first of the month, because Mercury is moving, right now Mercury, today on May 29th, Mercury is 90 degrees or square to Neptune, so we may be a little confused. The news of the day out of Washington was Robert Mueller giving an unannounced news conference, and what he said was actually confusing to a lot of people. I mean, I don't want to get into political analysis right now, but it was a perfect example of a Mercury square Neptune, and yet with Jupiter in opposition to it, there's this big idea, this overriding bigger philosophy that somehow is brought into the equation. The other thing that's going on these days is that Neptune, who is in high focus, is forming a sextile. This is a cooperative aspect to Saturn back here in Capricorn and to Venus in Taurus. And so I don't want to dig too deeply because I want to move ahead, but the fact of the matter is that the end of May, and all of these planets I'm talking about are moving slowly enough so that if we move this forward, and actually we will, right now incidentally, the moon is at 16 degrees of Aries, 16 and a half degrees of Aries, which is exactly lined up with my sun, for anyone who cares. And even for those of you who don't. So we're now going to move this ahead. Come on. There we go. And we're going to make this go noon. And we're going to move this ahead to June 1st. Now you can see on June 1st, we still have the Jupiter square Neptune and opposed Mercury, but those red lines aren't quite as thick. And that means that this energy is dying down. It's settling, it's waning, if you will. The aspects are separating. However, we begin the month with this very powerful conjunction of the moon in Taurus. The moon loves being in Taurus. Does anybody know why the moon loves being in Taurus?
No, go ahead.
You're right, by the way. No. Anybody?
Because it's calm and fixed.
Yeah, because you see, the moon is always changing. The moon is our moods. You know, if you're in a mood for 3 days, you ain't in a mood, you're in a Mars. You know, or maybe a Mercury. Worse yet, you could be in a Saturn if it lasts for weeks or months, and then you got to do something about it. But if you're in a bad mood a couple of hours later, because the moon is always moving, always changing, the moods don't last. That's what a mood is. So if the moon is about our changing feelings, Taurus is about having our feet on the ground. And the moon likes to be in Taurus because it gets to change and still feel secure. Because there's a reliability to Taurus. And so the moon in traditional astrological jargon is said to be exalted in Taurus. Every planet has a sign that when it's away from its home sign, the moon's home sign is Cancer, but every planet has a sign that's away from its home sign where it's just happy. And the moon is that in Taurus. Now, the other piece of the opening of June is this. Every planet relates to a sign, and every sign relates to a planet. Because of the discovery of newer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, there are some planets that up until then did double duty, and there are some signs that now have an ancient or traditional ruler and a modern ruler. But you can just think that every sign connects with a planet, and every planet connects with a sign. The planet that connects with, that's at home in, whose domicile is Taurus, is Venus. Taurus is a Venusian sign. It's about love and beauty and sensuality, not sexuality, but of the senses, sensuality. And so we begin June with the moon exalted in Taurus coming into a conjunction with Venus, who's at home in Taurus. This is pretty damn cool. And in fact, they are both being grounded by a trine to Saturn. Normally, Venus and Saturn don't do great together because Venus is warm and Saturn is cold. Venus is about interacting and merging and dancing cheek to cheek, and Saturn is about following the rules and being isolated and logical and rational. And yet, the trine between this Moon-Venus conjunction and Saturn gives us a sense that the beginning of the month, even now, today, tomorrow, the end of May and the beginning of June, there's a sense of things are real. The craziness, it hasn't gone away. But there's a sense of knowing what we like, of a return to the common sense of values. Again, just leaning on the news, because often the news reflects these energies, even though we experience them in a personal manner, they're kind of reflecting it in a global, cultural, political, economic, etc. manner. But the Republican congressman who made a statement and came out, against, Trump, or at least someone who actually read the Mueller report, and created a whole lot of negativity from the Republican power structure. That person went to a deeper place, and I'm not judging, although I would if push came to shove. I'm not judging what this person has done, but he's gone to a place, at least I'm not judging right versus wrong, I'm judging that he did go to a place that was deeper. And Pluto is about deeper. And Saturn is about real. And so when the Moon and Venus come across these points and trine Saturn, which was exact yesterday, and the trine to Pluto will be exact in the next couple of days. It will be exact on June 2nd. There's a sense of that which we love is deeper, more passionate, more powerful, and more real. And this is something that we might each express in our own way. Now, as I move this forward a couple of days, watch the moon getting closer and closer to the sun, because we have a new moon, which is when the sun and the moon are actually lined up in the exact same place. And that new moon is it's at 3:01. I'm going to just put 3 a.m. will be close enough here. And here we have the sun and the moon both at 12 degrees of Gemini within a minute. It's actually, if I moved it forward, that moon would be at 12:34 also. So once a month, the moon catches up with the sun. And this new moon, in whatever sign it is in, represents a new beginning. Where we've been in a phase where the new moons have occurred the very, very end of the months, but now we've shifted, and it's almost like we start off June with a new flavor. Well, it's not completely new, because we've already had Mercury in Gemini for a bit. The sun has been in Gemini for a week and a half, almost 2 weeks. And so we have this sense of the energetic, of the communication, of the restlessness, of the it's time to say something, do something, just activity. And yet this new moon on June 3rd plants a seed. And if we're paying attention to the rhythms individually, it's time for us to plant a seed. And in Gemini, that seed is not necessarily going out into the garden and planting a bulb. You should have done that, 3 months ago. The seeds of Gemini are intellectual. They're communication. They're bringing things up in communication. They're interactive. And so what this new moon is suggesting is that this is a great time to begin dialogues, to talk, to make plans, to think about, because Gemini is a thinking about sign. However, they will not be shallow thoughts. Why? Because we have Venus still hanging on to that trine to Pluto, which is going to intensify and deepen whatever it is. So it's interesting that we have the energy of this lightweight, kind of whimsical, kite flying in the breeze Gemini. You know, Gemini is bouncy, it moves around, it goes with the winds, it's fickle, it's changeable, it's adaptable, it's clever. I mean, Mercury, you know, if you want to have a good time, you know, hang out with some, and you don't want to go deep, the Mercury person or the Gemini person is the person who can be very clever and connect the dots. So this new moon is a beginning point, and there's one other aspect that I want to talk about, and that is the planet Mars, which is not very strongly connected to anything right now. But Mars down here in the sign of Cancer, and I think I started out at the very beginning of the talk this evening talking about wuss, wussier, and wussiest. And Mars in Cancer can be strong, but it can often be perceived as a wuss, as someone who's soft, as gentle. You see, because Cancer is a nurturing sign. Cancer has to do with creating protective boundaries for security around those you love. Cancer is the womb, it's the belly, it's the womb, which is protective around the baby who then is floating in an infinite soup, if you will. Cancer is home and family. It's, again, our home is our outer skin. We're protected, we're safe within the home. We'll be talking more about Cancer in a bit because on the solstice, on the first day of summer, that's when the sun moves out of the sign of Gemini, the whimsical, adaptable, changeable Gemini, into the sign of Cancer, and that's the beginning of the new season. We'll talk about that a little bit later. I'll also talk about that more extensively in my mid-month update, and I should mention here that at Patreon, patreon.com/Rick Levine, I do more videos than just this free video for the internet community. I do a mid-month update, and that mid-month update is $3 a month, and there's a host of other video services that are available that I don't want to talk about now. You can check it out, and that would be great. But I'll be talking more about the energy of Cancer as the sun moves into Cancer on the summer solstice, because the mid-month updates, I always focus in on something that happens, what a surprise, in the mid-month. But what I do want to say here is that Mars right now is pushed ahead of the sun. You see, Mars is the leading planet in all of this. Mars is the planet that's farthest out ahead. And there's a real anomaly here. And the anomaly is that Mars, which is about assertion and direction and pushing out and being in the forefront, is in the sign of Cancer, which is kind of cautious and careful and timid and holding back. So as I said earlier, when I was talking about how the moon really likes being in Taurus and how Venus is at home in Taurus, Mars don't like being in Cancer because it's hard for Mars to get angry. It's hard for Mars to go forward. It's hard for Mars to hit back when hit. Now, Mars is the warrior planet, but it's not just about making fights and war for no reason. It's not just about defending the scrimmage line in football. It's also about taking care of your home and family. It's about establishing boundaries so that you don't become vulnerable in situations where maybe it wouldn't be wise to be vulnerable. So Mars in Cancer is not a bad thing. Does anybody here know they have Mars in Cancer? No. Okay. Mars in Cancer is not a bad thing. It's just a difficult thing because it's easy when Mars is in Cancer for us to become passive aggressive, meaning that instead of expressing the anger, and you don't have to express anger by hitting someone, you can express anger by telling someone what your position is and meaning it and doing it firmly, and then having a very calm and logical discussion about it that creates some sort of agreement about what that boundary is. Granted, there are those who instead will just hit. There are countries that rather than having sensible and logical discussions will just push a button. I think we live in one of those countries. But the point here is that Mars in Cancer has more going on the inside that's tough to express. And it won't be until Mars moves into Leo, which it does somewhere in here. It doesn't do until next month. I don't have the date in front of me, but it does in July. The fact is that all of June, Mars in Cancer is holding on to some of its anger. What that means is that personally, we would be wise to remember that processing, standing up for ourselves, processing boundaries, and even getting angry when appropriate is better than letting it build and build and build until under a Uranus transit it explodes, which is what might happen. So we have Mars in Cancer at this new moon. We're kicking off the month. We move on, and by June 8th, we have our first. No, we have on the day after the new moon. We have Mercury here at the bottom of the chart at 28 degrees of Gemini, and then on June 4th, the day after the new moon, Mercury moves into Cancer, and in Cancer, it's joining the building Cancerian party. This is Tuesday, June 4th, actually. Mercury moving into Cancer. Mercury in Gemini, where it's been for a week and a half or so, Mercury right now is moving rather quickly, so it's spending just a couple of weeks in each sign. Mercury is actually moving faster than the sun right now from Earth's point of view. It's like a pendulum that when it reaches each edge, it slows down to turn direction, but it's moving fastest right in the middle. And when the planet lines up with the sun, Mercury in this case, it's moving fast. But what that means is it only spent a couple of weeks in Gemini, and it's moving into Cancer. And in Gemini, there's communication going, there's interaction, there's a buzz. Maybe you feel it in your life where there's too many things to do, or maybe you're too busy, or there's just stuff. There's a lot of backwards and forwards energy. On June 4th, when Mercury moves into Cancer, we might be confused for a day or two because that interactive Mercury at home goes a little quiet. Maybe it's just that we've been running around too much and we decide to take a breath. We decide to go home and take a nap instead of going to the dinner with our 16 friends or people we don't know or whatever it is. Now, again, Mars has already been in Cancer, so we may have some of this going already. But the moon moves into Cancer after the Gemini new moon. The moon moves into Cancer on June 4th, followed by Mars. And so we have this whole energetic shift. Just pay attention to it. It's Tuesday, June 4th. The next thing that happens that I want to talk about is on June 8th. We have Venus moving closer and closer to the end of Taurus. And on June 8th, Venus moves from Taurus into Gemini. That happens very late. That's late on June 8th. But the fact of the matter is that Venus, having been at home where she's just kind of hanging out and enjoying. All of a sudden, she's in Gemini, and it's almost like it's like a relay race, like Mercury. Our minds were in Gemini, and then we need a rest, and then just a few days later, Venus comes into Gemini. It might be, you know what? I'm really missing that noise. I really like that interaction. Venus isn't what's going on; it's what we like. And while Venus is in Gemini and she's moving toward the sun, slowly going to catch up with the sun. It'll take quite a while, but Venus moving through Gemini is it increases our attachment to words, our enjoyment with interacting with friends and with people in general. So that's another sign of change. Now, by the following day, the sun, and this would be building through this month, but the sun is exactly square to Neptune and opposing Jupiter through the 8th, 9th, and 10th. And this reconfigures, this reheats the fact that, remember, we started out that if we went back to today, we'd have Mercury in that position, and Mercury was opposite Jupiter and square Neptune. This is the end of May, beginning of June. Now, a week and a half down the road, we have the sun slipping into that point, and it may be that in the news, some of the things that are in the news today come back up on another level. Now, I'm not saying this will happen, but it would be like Mueller, who said in public some things today that were very obvious if you listened to him, and yet there were places he didn't go or things he didn't say, and he said why he didn't say it. But it may be by that first, second week in June, maybe he's called in to testify, or something else happens and releases. Often when planets go through the same spot, if we are aware of them when something hit the first time, then when something else comes back around through that same point, it's like that same energy is stirred up again, but it's different. Are you with me here? So I think that this is an important piece of, an important time. But again, there's a lot of big ideas, a lot of thinking. The sun is opposite Jupiter, Jupiter in his own sign. Jupiter in Sagittarius. Jupiter is about expansion. It's about bigger and better and more. And in Sagittarius, I want to change the name of Sagittarius to Exagittarius. Because Sagittarius is about going far. It's the distant horizon. It's the archer aiming his arrow up into space. The intentions of hope and of possibilities and of infinite potential. Sagittarius are the philosophers. They're the world travelers. And with the sun opposite Jupiter, there's that sense of our hopes are big. We may even be overconfident to the extent that we do stupid things. Be careful. Or at least be aware. Let's not be careful, be aware. And at the same time, the sun is squaring Neptune. And you know, Neptune and Jupiter have something in common. Does anybody want to guess what Neptune and Jupiter have in common? Say again? All of those things are true, but they have a sign in common. Because historically, Jupiter was the planet associated with Pisces. In modern astrology, we've given Neptune to the sign of Pisces. So they are considered to be co-rulers, and in some ways they're the exact same energy. The only difference is Jupiter's inside Saturn, so it can only expand up to the limits. That's why it's the philosopher. It has to be within the bounds of rationality. Neptune, on the other hand, is like Jupiter that's escaped from Saturn. It doesn't have to answer to dad, the church, the government, or any rules. It can imagine anything. So whereas Jupiter is the sign of the philosopher, Neptune is the sign of the dreamer, of the artist, of the intuitive. Got it? The sun on January 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, right in that period of time, is activating both Jupiter and Neptune, which through this year are moving in and out several times of this square from one to another. And that really has a little bit of the background of what goes on throughout this year, this dance between the reality of what's possible, Jupiter, and fake, whatever you want to call it. All right, let's move on. We got the 9th, the 10th, the 9th, 10th, the sun is squaring Neptune and opposing Jupiter. Now, by the 13th and 14th, we have a slightly different thing that comes in, and that is Mars. And Mars down here is actually moving through Cancer, and it's going to go opposite first Saturn and then Neptune. And then later in the month, it will be followed by Mercury, which is moving faster than Mars. Mercury will catch up with Mars, and it may be that this whole communication of anger thing might become a little bit too much of an issue, especially because we may be expressing it passively and aggressively. Are you with me here? And we can watch the politics develop around this. But as Mercury moves towards catching up with Mars, first Mars will form a harmonious trine with Neptune. That's that blue line. And then it will be opposite Saturn and then Neptune. So I'm going to just move that forward. Watch down here. There's Mars. That red line and blue line are getting thicker. And here on the 12th, 13th, 14th, Mars moves into 17 degrees, 18 degrees. It's now exactly trine on the 13th to Neptune. And then on the 13th, 14th, it then is exactly opposite Saturn. Can you see that? Now, incidentally, on the 14th, I don't talk about the moon transits day by day. I do often more on the mid-month update because there's only a week and a half or so ahead of me rather than a whole month. But on that June 14th, the moon will be moving through watery Scorpio. Neptune is in a 14-year stay in watery Pisces, and Mars will be trining both of those points in watery Cancer with the north node of the moon there and Mercury coming into it. This is a very powerful grand water trine. It shows an emotional self-stability. And what's significant here is that this grand trine is actually what we call a kite. Let me show you this real quickly, and then we will move on. So can you see how that looks like a kite? A kite is a grand trine that's 3 planets like an equilateral triangle with 1 planet opposite one of the points on the grand trine. Now, grand trines are like closed-circuit TV. It's the energy. In ancient astrology, a grand trine was the coolest damn thing you could have in your chart. It was a blessing because the energy works. In modern psycho-spiritual astrology, grand trines aren't as nice. Why? Because it's hard to get traction to do something different. If the energy is just working, if every time, if you're an organized crime assassin, and every time you go out and kill someone, you come home and you turn on your TV and it's playing a program of how cool you are, it's like you'll continue doing the same thing because you have this self-referential feedback loop going. And grand trines can be wonderful because they are a way of finding stability. In water, it's emotional self-stability or self-containment. In air, it's intellectual stability. In fire, it's stability through doing things. In earth, it's a practical self-sustenance. But here, we have a special case called a kite, where we have Saturn and Pluto that are opposite one point and forming sextiles with the other, and oppositions are where we project into the outer world. Oppositions in astrology are like relationships, and therefore this grand trine has a way out. And this is why we began the talk this evening talking about Saturn and Pluto, because even though Saturn and Pluto are not exact, 18, they're only 3.5 degrees away from one another in a birth chart, that would be considered to be a conjunction. I mean, they're together, but they're not exactly together. But it's that point that is the way out from our passive aggressiveness, from that Mars in Cancer. So in our personal lives and in the global political scene, look for powerful things to happen that are statements of unexpressed anger or hostility. Often with that Mars in Cancer, it's like, are you angry? No, I'm fine. You seem angry. No, I'm fine. I'm really fine. I'm really okay. But it's that sense of denial about something, some fear, something. And this is a day where we might see that come out. All right, let's move on. We got a couple of other things to get to. And
What day is that again?
mid-June, Flag Day, June 14. I think it might be someone's famous's birthday that day. All right, let's get rid of that. All right, so that's June 14th. We got, and the other thing, though, is about that Mars opposing Saturn on June 14th. The grand trine is lovely. Mars doesn't like running into Saturn. Why? Mars is the gas pedal. Saturn is the wall. Not a good combo. Mars is the gas, Saturn is the brake. Mars is the gas. Mars says go, Saturn says stop. Mars says yes, Saturn says no. Mars says I'm gonna. Dad or the cop says no, you ain't. You know, there's that dance between the impulsive Mars and the need to restrain it, constrain it, deny it, suppress it, repress it. So this can be this is a powerful day. It can be a really good day, but there's a bit of tricky energy around it. I mean, there's other things that we could talk about, including how these planets in Cancer are also quincunx. That's 5/12 of a circle to Jupiter. It's easy to overreact and do more than we need to. Pay attention to your energy over those days. It can be very powerfully good, but it can also be frustrating because Mars knows exactly what it needs to do, where it wants to go, how it's going to get there, and it heads there, and as soon as it's out the door, it runs into Saturn. No, you can't. You're not ready yet. You have to go back to the drawing board. This is what Saturn tells impulsive Mars. And in a battle between Saturn and Mars, Saturn always wins. You know, Mars might be really good at war, but Saturn has a way of issuing the final verdict, so to speak. Remember, Saturn's karma. You know, it is the Grim Reaper. All right, so that's the middle of the month. We move on after that month. We have on the 16th, Mercury now coming into the mix, into that grand trine, but the moon is beginning to move on. So as Mercury moves into it, it only gets part of it. Can you see how Mercury is now sliding into this place? And incidentally, this little thing that looks like headphones is the north node of the moon. And although I don't talk about it here much outwardly, I'm taking that into strong consideration because the nodes of the moon are the place where the orbit of the Earth around the sun is cut by the orbit of the moon around the Earth. And these points, these nodal points, nodes are knots. It's where reality gets tied up into itself and makes real things happen. The nodes of the moon are incredibly important. They're so important that we Westerners say, oh, they're just points. But in Jyotish, in the Vedic tradition, in Hindu astrology, if you will, they look at the nodes and they don't make them any more diminished. They say they're shadow planets. Just because you can't see them doesn't mean they're any less important. And during this period of time in mid-June, we have Mars lining up with the nodal axis, followed by Mercury. And so the fact that all of this is kind of happening really puts some pressure on the middle of the month. and yet we got this trine to Neptune that basically is like the Everly Brothers or whoever it was that sang that song "Dream On." Dream a little, dream. Does anybody know that song? I hate singing in front. Yeah. So that period of time becomes also the way out, becomes our fantasies, which is good news and bad news. It's good news as long as we're aware of it and we know what our fantasies are. It's bad news if we begin to confuse the fantasy with reality. So by the time we get to the 16th, 17th, Mercury has slid into the space where Mars was. Now notice, Mercury is catching up to Mars, and Mercury actually catches up to Mars on June 18th. So you can see here we got this little thing here developing. We're going to move it another 12 hours at a time forward. And again, you can see that Mercury forming the quincunx to Jupiter like Mars did, the opposition to Saturn, and the trine to Neptune. What does this mean? Well, this means all the feisty, and it means we may be talking about whatever it was that happened a day or two ago with Mars there when we or someone did something that maybe overstepped their boundaries. Are you with me here? Because Mercury is the interaction, it's the communication. And so as Mercury moves into place, it hits the quincunx to Jupiter that says, more, bigger, go for it, say what you need to. Doesn't matter if you might offend someone, go ahead and say it. It's trine to Neptune saying, but what you're saying may be based on fantasy, and it's opposing Saturn, and then a day or two later it'll oppose Pluto, which basically says, this is the end. This is, you're now running into reality. This is the truth. It may be yours. It may be someone else's. Either way, reality has to deal with it. And as you move that on, by the following day, Mercury then is moved on to being opposite Pluto by the 18th. Mercury is opposite Pluto exactly on the 19th. And then, of course, Mercury is also here. You can see if I back it up. You see here Mercury is before Mars. It goes node, Mercury, Mars, and then boom, those two change direction because Mercury moving faster catches up. And over the days and weeks ahead, Mercury will move further and further and further away from the pack because it moves faster than anything else. But all these planets are in Cancer. And Cancer is still about what isn't said. It's about our feelings. It's about our emotions. It's how we nurture each other. And then as we continue to move this forward, we skipped right over the full moon, which is on the 17th. We need to go back to the 17th. And there is the full moon at 1:30 a.m. So let's just put that in here. 1:30 a.m. There is, that didn't work. Because we need to be on June 17th. So there we go. All right, so June 17th at 1:30 a.m. on the West Coast. The moon will be exactly opposite the sun. This is the sun-moon opposition. This is the second lunation of the month. This is the time when the seeds that we planted in thought back on the third at the new moon. This is when these seeds begin to become fruit. Remember, the lunar cycle is a 30-day cycle. It's a new moon to full moon to new moon. And so in this 2-week emotional process, the thoughts that we had now are reaching culmination. Interestingly enough, this full moon has tied up in it, though, still this Mercury-Mars conjunction that's opposite Saturn and trine Neptune. Normally, we look at a new moon and we go, what are the aspects to that new moon or full moon? Because that's the flavor of it. in both the new moon and full moon in June, there aren't many aspects to the new moon and full moon itself, but there are other aspects that are important. And here it is the node Mercury-Mars that is so important because of its opposition to the Saturn-Pluto. And remember, all these things that are happening now are all aiming toward building as the Saturn turns direct and eventually joins up with Pluto next January. So we're just trying to frame that in a larger sense of things. And then, of course, we're back to Mercury catching up with Mars, and in Cancer. But again, it's communication, but we might be very careful and very cautious about what we say. And the other thing about Mars and Mercury in Cancer, and in a couple more days the Sun will join them in Cancer, is that we're very sensitive. Our feelings are very much reflective of what's going on around us. On the way to that, though, we have Mars now moving, and Mercury too, both past the opposition to Saturn, past the trine to Jupiter, and they're both coming into an opposition with Pluto. And here it gets a bit more intense. That first opposition is the Mercury opposed Pluto in the morning of the 19th, and then Mars right behind it later that same day. And these are incredibly powerful aspects because, and especially because the moon is sweeping through there on June 19th, all leading up to the first day of summer. It's like the whole thing is coming to a culmination. There's stuff that's going down that's reaching a frenzied height right here, except Saturn is just holding it back, keeping the lid on. And once the planets are past Saturn, by the time we get to the 19th, 20th, and 21st, it's like something's now changing. It's now moving on a deeper level when Mercury and Mars oppose Pluto the same day that the moon joins up with Pluto on the 19th into the early 20th. And then on June 21st, we have actually Neptune turning retrograde. When the outer planets turn retrograde, it can be very important. I don't spend a lot of time talking about them here. They're subtle, but it's like a 5-month process that begins the interning, the pulling in of our dreams and imaginations. And it might be so subtle you don't notice it. And yet, if you're particularly attuned to Neptune, if you have a moon in Pisces or Mercury or Sun in Pisces, you may be very aware of the fact that something's going on and that Neptune's beginning to slow down. More importantly, or I should say more obviously, the Sun moves, here at the bottom of the chart, the Sun moves from Gemini, an adaptable, changing sign, into Cancer, the beginning of a new season. The cardinal signs in astrology are Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn. They are season starting signs. Season starting signs, cardinal, initiate into something new. The Sun in Cancer initiates the summer. Here in the Northern Hemisphere, obviously. In the Southern Hemisphere, they're just going to be going into their winter. The fact, though, is that we are now in a new astrological month, starting on the 21st, and for a few days, we'll have the Sun and the nodes, the North Node, and Mars and Mercury all in Cancer, and yet we have Venus lagging back here in Gemini. And remember, the month started with Mercury forming that opposition to Jupiter and square to Neptune. Well, now we have Venus coming into that same position. And once again, there's this kind of the idea of something big, Jupiter. We like it, Venus, but we may take something too much too far. And because it's Venus and Jupiter, it doesn't necessarily have to be removed philosophy. Venus is the planet of love. It's the planet of what you like. Venus is money. So Venus opposing Jupiter and squaring Neptune on the 23rd and 24th can be a day when it's really easy to fall in love. Maybe with something that isn't there. Why? Because it's squaring Neptune. It's fantasy. Now remember, Venus and Neptune together, you can say it's fantasy, but it's also romanticism, because that's what romance is, the use of the imagination to create another layer in the fabric. We also can overspend, overindulge, overdo. This is a bit of a different energy than we've been experiencing, but by the time we get to that 23rd, 24th, it's really a smart idea to make sure your wallet stays in your pocket unless you take it out for a good reason. But it's easy to take that wallet out to do something that's fun, not that you shouldn't, or something that's just, a self-indulgent, not that you shouldn't. Just don't do it unconsciously, or you may be paying for it for a long time to come. On the 26th, we have Mercury, which has whizzed through the sign of Cancer, and Mercury becomes the first planet moving into Leo. Leo, the sign of the midsummer. Leo, the sign of butterflies and flowers and the relentless summer sun. And although we still have another almost month before the sun gets there, it'll only be a few days until Mars is there. But Mercury, by June 27th, begins to stretch our antenna out. And often when Mercury is far ahead of the sun like this, often the next season comes early. As opposed to sometimes when Mercury is way behind the sun, often it seems like a season won't let go. But here, with Mercury so far ahead of the sun, it may feel like, even though it's still early summer, it might feel like, geez, it's really midsummer. And yet we have another 3 weeks before the sun gets into the midsummer sign of Leo. Mercury in Leo is less contemplative, less emotional, and less responsive than it was in Cancer. When Mercury moves into Leo, instead of just thinking about it, we want to say it. There used to be an old commercial from back when I was a kid. We had like crank up TVs and we had to, boil our own plutonium to make electricity. No, but there was a commercial, a breakthrough technology, a breakthrough service was offered. And that was, for the first time, you could use your telephone and dial a number and have flowers delivered to anywhere in the country. This was like a really big deal thing, And the company that did this was called the FTD, the Floral Transmission Delivery, or Floral Transport, Something like that. FTD. And I only remember it because of its commercial. And its commercial has stuck in my mind throughout all these years because it's a perfect glyph or symbol for Mercury in Leo. And it was an animated black and white talking head that from its mouth came animated bouquets of flowers. And it just said, "Say it with flowers." Say it with flowers. I mean, it's a commercial that played a lot back in the days that if you had a TV, there was only 1 or 2 or 3 stations to watch. So, you couldn't go surfing, through all these infinite choices. Anyhow, Mercury in Leo wants to say it with flowers. Flowers are about expression. They're about beauty that shines when looked at by the sun. The sun gives awareness to something. Mercury in Leo wants to put on the show. Mercury in Leo is less about feeling something and then communicating their emotions. It's doing it in a way that's like on center stage. It's basically creating a presentation, if you will. That pretty much brings us to the end of the month. As we come to July, though, we're moving into eclipse season, and we're also moving into a time when, when we have the next Mercury retrograde that begins on July 7th. This coming Mercury retrograde will not be nearly as ugly, as difficult as the previous Mercury retrograde through most of March, because it was dancing around nebulous Neptune and it stayed within the sign of nebulous Pisces. And Mercury has a hard time there because Mercury is logical and Pisces is dreamy. So So Mercury toward the end of June will be slowing down as it's getting ready to turn retrograde. But in June, we have a lot of forward motion all month. Neptune does turn retrograde. Jupiter is retrograde. Saturn and Pluto are retrograde. I sound like I just contradicted myself, but all of these planets are the slower moving outer planets. Meanwhile, Mercury, Venus, and Mars are all moving ahead, and that's the daily noise of our everyday interactions. It feels like things are moving ahead, but behind it, underneath, there's stuff going on that ain't done yet. It might feel like on one level we've moved ahead and we're done with whatever it was we were dealing with a few months ago. It ain't true. It ain't over till it's over, and it ain't over. And that's the important lesson of June, is that don't get so wrapped up in what it appears on the surface to be moving into the future fast. It ain't done yet, and we have more to happen. And as we move into July, we'll be reprocessing a lot of that as Mercury turns retrograde. So with all these planets in Gemini, enjoy the interactions as they move into Cancer. Slow the energy down consciously, but be aware of unexpressed anger or unexpressed need to go somewhere, do something, or to create a boundary, because that which is held in eventually will come out and will explode. That's it.